It was a cold, winter night, and I was home alone, trying to finish some last-minute work on my computer. The wind howled outside, and the snow was piling up against the windows, making the house feel even more isolated. The glow from the monitor was the only light in the room, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I was deep in concentration when a loud, insistent knock at the door jolted me out of my work. I glanced at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up to see who could be knocking at this ungodly hour. Peering through the peephole, I saw 2 children standing on my porch. They looked to be around 10 years old, a boy and a girl, both dressed in old-fashioned clothes. They didn't seem to notice the freezing cold, despite being dressed inadequately for the weather. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please let us in," the girl said in a monotone voice. "We're cold and need to use your phone." Something about her voice sent a chill down my spine. It was flat and emotionless, almost robotic. The boy looked up at me then, and that's when I saw their eyes. They were entirely black, no whites, no irises, just endless, dark voids. A wave of fear washed over me, and I instinctively stepped back, tightening my grip on the door. "I'm sorry, I can't let you in," I stammered, my heart racing. "Please," the boy repeated, his voice matching the girl's in its eerie monotone. "We need to come in." I shook my head and quickly shut the door, locking it firmly. I could hear them knocking persistently, their pleas growing more insistent. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. Every instinct I had screamed that something was terribly wrong. I rushed to my computer and searched for any information on black-eyed children. To my horror, I found countless stories similar to mine. People described the same encounters: 2 children asking to be let in, their black eyes filling them with inexplicable dread. No one knew what happened if you let them in, but the overwhelming consensus was that nothing good came of it. The knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I peeked through the peephole again, but they were gone, leaving no footprints in the snow. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a nightmare, but sleep was out of the question. The next day, I told my neighbor, Mrs. Collins, about the encounter. Her face paled, and she crossed herself. "Those children," she whispered, "they've been seen around here before, always asking to be let in. Don't ever let them in." Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the wind howled, I jumped, expecting to hear that insistent knocking again. I kept my doors and windows locked, refusing to go out after dark. One evening, just as I was starting to relax, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and my heart raced as I fumbled for a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows, but it did little to calm my nerves. Then I heard the knocking, slow, deliberate, echoing through the house. My blood ran cold as I made my way to the door. I knew who it would be. Peering through the peephole, I saw them again. The same black eyes, the same emotionless expressions. "Let us in," they said in unison, their voices eerily calm. "No," I whispered, backing away. "Leave me alone." The knocking continued, relentless. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound. After what felt like hours, it finally stopped. I collapsed on the floor, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, I found no trace of them. The snow was undisturbed, as if they had never been there. I decided then and there to leave. I couldn't stay in a place where they could find me again. I moved to a new town, far away from those dark-eyed children. But even now, I can't forget their faces. Their black eyes haunt my dreams, and every time I hear a knock at the door, my heart skips a beat, fearing their return. It was a rainy night, and I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital, exhausted and eager to collapse into bed. The rain pounded against my windshield, making it difficult to see the road ahead. As I squinted through the downpour, I spotted a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the window. The figure, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped closer. Her long, dark hair clung to her pale face, and her white dress was soaked through. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain. She nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat. As she settled in, I noticed her eyes dark and distant, as if she was lost in a world of her own. I offered her my jacket, and she took it with a faint, grateful smile. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just down the road," she replied softly. "By the old cemetery." A shiver ran down my spine. The old cemetery was infamous in our town, the source of countless ghost stories and urban legends, but I shrugged off the unease and focused on the road. The silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. As we approached the cemetery, she turned to me. "You can drop me off here." I pulled over and turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. My jacket lay where she had sat, soaked but otherwise untouched. Panic set in, and I got out of the car, searching the deserted road. There was no sign of the girl. My heart raced as I remembered the stories about the vanishing hitchhiker, a ghostly figure who appeared on rainy nights, seeking rides from unsuspecting drivers. The legend said she had died in a car accident near the cemetery decades ago and now haunted the road, reliving her final moments. I drove to the nearest gas station, desperate for some sense of reality. The attendant, an older man with a weary expression, listened to my story and nodded knowingly. "You've seen her," he said. "Many have. She appears, asks for a ride, and vanishes before reaching the cemetery. She's been doing it for years." I felt a chill run down my spine as his words sank in. I had encountered a ghost, a restless spirit doomed to wander the roads forever. That night I barely slept, haunted by the memory of her sorrowful eyes. Determined to understand more, I visited the local library the next day and searched through old newspapers. I found the story of Emily Thompson, a young woman who had died in a car accident in 1952. She had been on her way to meet her fiancé at the cemetery when her car skidded off the road during a storm. Her body was never found, adding to the mystery of her disappearance. I decided to visit the cemetery, hoping to find some closure. As I walked among the old, weathered tombstones, I found her grave. The epitaph read in loving memory of Emily, "Forever young I placed my jacket on her grave, a small gesture of respect and sorrow for a life cut tragically short." As I stood there, I felt a presence beside me. Turning, I saw her, the same young woman from the road. She looked at me with those same sorrowful eyes, but there was a hint of gratitude in them. She nodded once before fading away, leaving me alone in the cemetery. I left the cemetery feeling a strange sense of peace. The encounter had shaken me, but it had also given me a deeper understanding of the world beyond our own. Emily's story was a tragic one, but perhaps, in some way, my act of kindness had helped her find a measure of peace. To this day, I avoid that road on rainy nights, not out of fear, but out of respect. I often wonder if Emily still wanders the roads, seeking the ride she never completed. And I hope that, someday, she will find the rest she deserves. I had just moved into an old high-rise building in downtown, a place that carried the weight of countless stories within its walls. The building had seen better days. Its paint was peeling, and the hallways were dimly lit. But the rent was affordable, and it had a certain nostalgic charm that drew me in. The first thing I noticed was the elevator. It was ancient, a relic from a bygone era, with creaky doors and buttons that had long lost their labels. Mrs. O'Eary, the building manager, noticed my apprehension. "It has a mind of its own," she said with a knowing smile. "Sometimes it stops at the wrong floors. Just be patient." I laughed it off, assuming it was just old-fashioned superstition. Who believes in haunted elevators, after all? But my skepticism was put to the test on my very first night. After a long day at work, I returned home late. The elevator doors groaned open, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 10th floor. The elevator shuddered to life, but instead of going up, it descended. A chill ran down my spine as the numbers on the display flickered, finally settling on B2, the second basement. The doors slid open, revealing a pitch-black corridor. I had never been to the basement. It was used for storage. I reached for the button to close the doors, but my hand froze as I heard faint whispers. My heart pounded, and I strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the corridor. "Help us," they pleaded. "Please, help us." I pressed the button frantically, and the doors finally closed. The elevator jolted and began to ascend, stopping at my floor. I bolted out and rushed to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My heart raced, and I struggled to calm myself. The whispers followed me into my dreams, haunting and persistent. The next day, I decided to investigate. I delved into the history of the building and discovered a tragic tale. Decades ago, a fire had broken out in the basement, trapping several residents who had taken shelter there. They were never found, presumed dead. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I spoke to some of the older residents. "People have gone missing in this building," one old man told me, his eyes wide with fear. "They say their spirits are trapped in the basement." I decided to investigate further, despite my growing dread. Armed with a flashlight, I took the elevator down to B2. The corridor was dark and foreboding, the air thick with a musty smell. I followed the whispers, which led me to a locked storage room. The padlock was rusty, almost falling apart. I broke it open and stepped inside. The room was filled with old furniture and boxes, but in the corner, I saw a pile of bones. Human bones. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, horrified. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Thank you," they sighed. "You have freed us." I ran from the basement, never looking back. The elevator now operated normally, but I couldn't stay in the building. I moved out the next day, leaving behind the haunted high-rise and its dark secrets. Months passed, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I often wondered about the lost souls trapped in the basement and whether they truly found peace. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the building. It was quiet, almost serene. I hesitantly took the elevator down to B2, bracing myself for the worst. The basement was silent. The air felt lighter, the oppressive darkness gone. I stepped into the corridor and approached the storage room. The bones had been removed, and the room was empty. As I stood there, I felt a strange sense of closure. The building, once haunted by its tragic past, seemed to have found peace. I left, feeling a weight lifted off my shoulders. The haunted elevator, the whispers, the lost souls, they were all part of a story that had finally found its ending. And I, too, could move on, leaving behind the memories of the haunted high-rise and its eerie elevator.